Good evening, all of you. Welcome back to the workshop after a span of a few days. We've had a gap of a few days because Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan could not deliver his lecture as he fell ill. So now we are back and we have Dr. Sanal Mohan here with us. The moderator for today is Dr. M.T. Narayanan. He's a faculty member of the Department of History. And I hand over the session to him. Dr. M.T. Narayanan, over to you.
Thank you, Shiba. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of the seminar series, that is International Workshop on Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Searches, organized by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit College, in association with the Kerala Council of Historical Research, Thiruvananthapuram. Today, we have Dr. Sanal Mohan, Professor, School of Social Sciences, MG University, Kottayam, with us as the resource person. Before going to Sanal, let me now invite Mr. Srivas for a formal welcome address. Over to you, Srivas.
Good evening, all. Welcome to the fifth international webinar on Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Sources, hosted by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit College, with the financial assistance of the Kerala Council for Historical Research. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome the distinguished speaker, Dr. P. Sanal Mohan, for the day, who is here to deliver the talk. P. Sanal Mohan is professor in School of Social Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, India. He has worked as director, Kerala Council for Historical Research in Thiruvananthapuram. He was awarded the prestigious research grant of SSRC, New York, for the project titled From the Lord's Prayer to Invoking Slavery Through Prayers, Religious Practices and Dalits in Kerala, India. This was part of SSRC's larger project, New Directions in the Study of Prayer 2012-14. He was much visiting fellow in Commonwealth Studies and is affiliated to Clare Hall and Center of South Asian Studies, University of Cambridge. He is a life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic University, Göttingen, Germany in 2013 and 2015. He was a postdoctoral fellow in colonial and post-colonial studies at Emory University and a visiting fellow at the Center for the Advanced Study of India of the University of Pennsylvania. He combines history and ethnography in his research. His areas of interest include colonial modernity, social movements and questions of identity, Dalit movements and Christianity in India. He has published research articles on the discourses and practices of the Dalit movements. His book, Modernity of Slavery, Struggles Against Caste Inequality in Colonial Kerala, has been published by Oxford University Press, New Delhi in 2015. He is now working on a monograph, Global Christianity and the Transformation of Dalits in Colonial and Post-Colonial Kerala. Welcome, sir, and a warm welcome to all participants to the lecture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srivas, for your welcome address. Let me now remind the participants to mute your audio to avoid disturbances that will distract us from listening to lecture. Also, please feel free to write down your comments and questions in the chat box. With these introductory remarks, let me now invite my own good friend, Dr. Sanal Mohan, to deliver the address on archive and historians. Over to you, Professor Sanal.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Shiba and Professor M.T. Narayanan. Sometimes first name comes out because of friendship for the past several years with many of these organizers. And I'm extremely thankful to the Department of History, Sri Shankara University of Sanskrit, Kerala, the colleagues over there, and also the coordinator of this program, and also for the quite encouraging words by Srivas and my friend MT. So once again, thanks to everyone for listening to me, who have come to listen to me this afternoon. So when Professor Shiba asked me to be part of this workshop, Sensing the Past, she asked me to suggest a theme, and I could not suggest a theme immediately. And subsequently, I suggested that I could actually reflect on some questions that historians have been talking about, or not just historians. In certain ways, one could say that this is something which is being discussed among social anthropologists, cultural theorists, and many others who actually work with texts of various kinds. So therefore, obviously for professional requirements, or if you want to put it this, if I put it this way, looking at the history of the historical writing as a profession, or the teaching of history as a profession, we find mostly historians dealing with the kind of archives that come to our minds when we talk about archives, as a place where we have official documents or government documents which are kept. But otherwise, one could say that it is not just something that historians alone are concerned about. But for a variety of reasons, obviously historians are the real users of many of these archives or archival institutions, repositories, and so on. So therefore, my talk will be dealing with the way in which we look at the archive, and the way in which, as researchers in history, we end up creating our own archive. Or one could also talk about how other social scientists create their own archive. So therefore, it becomes something which is shared, which is some kind of a shared concern among social scientists broadly. So in the first part, I wish to discuss some of the issues that we confront in our engagement with the question of archive, and then I wish also to look at some of my experiences in organizing this archive. That's a big claim I shouldn't make, but let me say engaging with the archive, if not trying to organize it. Now, in fact, I also listened to the lectures of our other resource persons. In fact, some of the lectures, actually, you will find some a crossover of these ideas when I present mine. So one thing that I want to talk first is the need for, in certain ways, disentangling ourselves from this institutionally validated notions of archive. For example, if we actually think about the intellectual productions of social, let's say written materials, to put it as a very basic kind of thing. If we look at the written materials generated by different institutions, social movements, individuals, and so on, then you find easily that the idea of archive is there, very much distributed, very much available among various kinds of people. It's not just the government which does this kinds of thing, organize the government papers or official reports of the commissions of inquiry, or the reports of various government departments, all the official papers under one roof. In fact, we also know that people who are part of, or people who are really organizing social movements, or even in the local areas, even in villages, people do that. So therefore, my first submission is to disengage ourselves from the idea of archive as something which is basically organized by the government. In fact, this is something which was already discussed. Uh, so we move out of this idea with some of the practical things which I want to share with you subsequently. But to begin with, as people working in different areas of social sciences, we do end up in the archives of the government, or colonial archive, to be precise. So these colonial archives have really been studied by social scientists of very many intellectual persuasions. And obviously, as I said in the beginning, you find most of the historians dealing with that. Now, I wish to make a reference to some of the interesting works which we have, which again, I'm sure was discussed already in this forum. One of the books which I found as extremely useful for my thinking on this subject was Along the Archival Grain, Epistemic Anxieties and Colonial Common Sense by Anne Stoller. And she has also published a number of research articles in this area. And we have many other scholars, particularly those who dealt with or those who are writing in the area of post-colonial studies or subaltern studies. We have, in fact, a very significant article by Ranajit Guha in volume 2 of Subaltern Studies, which is titled as Prose of Counterinsurgents. And we can actually build on this, a list of scholars, or the books and articles that are already there, which try to problematize the idea of archives. And we do have our anthropologists, particularly those who have been specializing in social anthropology, who would actually talk about from archives to field and back. That's those who work in field work. I mean, those who engage with field works situations, people who a big problem involved in it, because only if we try to understand archive as a very different kind of entity, something like where you are not looking for already produced knowledge. So this is actually not my idea. You read this in Anstaller's book and in the writings of many other critical social scientists who have worked, who have used the archive to talk about whatever they wanted to talk, or who have used this archive to argue their cases. So the idea is that we are not looking at archive as a source of information. Instead of that, we look at this as a site where, in fact, knowledge production becomes possible. In one way, recall here the article, the process of counterinsurgency, where Guho himself talks about the need for understanding the codes of the colonial documentation, decoding them, etc., and then making use of this. Obviously, we also are really suggested to take care of the politics of this, the politics or the larger context that enable the production of archival materials, and that will enable us to decode this, and then we may want to read insurgency in a very different way. We are asked to look at the consciousness of the insurgent. So it is not as if it is a physical entity or something which can be dispensed of. We are not. Critical historians are asked to understand these historical documents in a particular way, which enables him or her to appreciate the context in which those documents are produced, and the conditions of their production, and the knowledge involved in the production of this. One can actually look at the ways in which, for example, a particular document narrates an event. If it is an insurgency or political mobilizations of that kind, how do we come across? That's the question. How do we come across a particular kind of narrative, and what made possible that such a narrative getting recorded? The choice of the phrases, the choice of the metaphors, and all these linguistic conventions that are packaged in this particular kind of document should enable us to understand the dimension of power, the dimension of politics, the dimension of knowledge, etc., involved in this particular document. And therefore, one thing which I want to emphasize, following this critical kind of knowledge with regard to the archival materials, is that we need to really look at archival materials as, in fact, embodying absolutely contestable kind of information, or rather, it is a site where different kinds of understanding of a particular event or a particular process is at work. So they have been always remaining in a contested relationship. It's not something which is completely resolved. So therefore, our approach to archival materials become very different. It's not a finished product that we look for. We are not looking to something with which we will give some references, etc. So more than that, our concern is to see how in the context of the documents that we are dealing with, or the larger archive that we are dealing with, we are looking at the dimensions of power involved in the production of this archival material. And that will help us to see how these different kinds of statements have been produced, what are the underlying connections, epistemological connections that have created this. Now, one can think about, the coexistence of different kinds of anxieties in the archive. Now, as we are dealing with colonial archive, then obviously, I mean, it is something which has been already discussed in various kinds of books that are available. Many scholars have discussed this, particularly in the context of colonial knowledge protection. So we have a huge literature in this particular area. And one of the central concerns of these sort of writings have been to see how the colonial knowledge was produced, or let's say the knowledge on the colonized people were produced, and how they were circulated and how they were normalized. And therefore, the archival, organizing an archive, or the kind of colonial machinery that have recorded these things, that have documented this, that have written about it using its own conventions, its own particular kind of deployment of categories. So those are really significant. In fact, in Anstaller's work, she refers to, the kind of half-caste context in Indonesia, where, I mean, in cities like Java, where you have this progeny of the indigenous women and the white men. So the kind of the policies that the colonial state should have about them, in addition to various other kinds of, transactions related to. Am I audible? Dr. Sheba, can you hear
Yes,
me?
sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so
Yes,
thank
sir,
you.
we can hear you.
Okay, so what I was suggesting was the kind of knowledge about ethnic communities and also the half-caste communities that have been created in the context of Dutch colonialism, and because in this particular work of Anstoller, she refers to that. And now, if we look at all the records that we have about famine, for example, or any other larger compendium of materials in the archive, so that will tell us about a very different kind of understanding of the colonized. So there is nothing esoteric about my stating this, because I'm sure people, all of those who are listening to me, definitely know this sort of things. But the point that I want to emphasize is to see, if we continue to see this as, if we are satisfied in understanding this as a certain kind of answer to our own research questions, and I guess that's a point where we need to be very cautious. Probably we are missing out much of the significant things over there. We need to really understand the dynamics of power that have created its own categories in these kinds of narrative reporting that we encounter in the archive. And therefore, one of the things is to understand archives as representing a process, or processes, and not as something where we can have, a thing like quality as far as information is concerned. So we may want to look at things in their larger evolution as part of a process, and how over a period of time one could actually look at archival materials to really understand the manner in which things have been spoken about. Again, one can bring in, when we want to talk about certain kind of social experiences. I can give you some examples subsequently, how the ideas of, for example, dominance and subordination have been represented, have been talked about, written about, narrated, and articulated in the archival materials. This will take us to the usual practice of reading these archival materials, which again is something which was discussed earlier. Alongside, we have oppositional reading of the archival materials against the grain reading. which again is something familiar to those of us who are in the practice of history writing or who are teaching history or engaged in writing history. And alongside that, we also look at, for example, reading the archive along the grain. That is trying to understand the context in which archival materials have been produced and then what happens there. So we may want to look at the mentality of the people who have produced this, the particular kind of archival material, or those who have written about particular conditions of the colonized, or even today, forget about the colonized. And I'm sure that this is a point which Professor Dilip and himself discussed in his talk. He was referring to the kind of the report. I mean the verdicts pronounced by Supreme Court in the context of many of the cases which were filed as part of cases that have been filed against the activists of the CAA some time back, and also even many of those verdicts that run into thousands of pages. In fact, some of the recent newspaper reports quoted that some of these Supreme Court verdicts actually ran into thousands and thousands of pages. And Professor Menon was referring to this as one of the examples of the political anxieties of the current regime. And I think we do come across similar kind of anxieties being articulated, not just historically, even in contemporary times, we have this. And if you look at, for example, many of the reports that we have as part of the governance generated by various government departments. So when we go to the archives and see this, we definitely understand, the kind of craving, for example, for development, for example, for scientific rationality, for example, for the kind of normalization that the state and society wants to have. The state and society really want to have, the kind of normalization that they argue for. So one could look at many of these reports, many of the verdicts of various courts and other kinds of public documentation, if I use that word, or let's say those sort of things which will end up eventually in the archive. That definitely give us a window into the ways in which the state is managing its own affairs. What does the state do when it employs its own kind of agents to talk about what is happening in contemporary society? So we do have a number of similar examples over here where we can bring in the ideas of, for example, power, knowledge, etc., getting involved in it, or intermeshing these sort of ideas in the production of, the various kinds of, the verdicts of the courts, or even the reports of the various government departments. So this will tell us that even for contemporary governance, or the documents which were generated by the compulsions of the government policies, governance, etc., we need to look at them in the larger processes of their evolution, and then that will help us to understand better how and in what conditions these have been produced. One example we can take, there is a lot of discussion on, for example, human rights today, or the right to information. So many other similar things which have not been there, say, let us say 20 years ago or 30 years ago, none of us would have been talking about this. And what does it mean when it comes to understanding the idea of human rights, or right to information, or right to education, etc.? How our own understanding of these things have changed over the decades when we reach this particular situation of really critiquing the kind of reports that have tried to problematize, things like human rights. And therefore, using this sort of methodology of the historian, who have been dealing with things like the archive or the creation of archives, which was one of, Anne would tell us that this was one of the greatest technologies of the 19th century, but it continues to be there, continues to be very, very powerful even today. And therefore, it is not just the archives of the government, that is the official archives of the post-colonial states or archives of the colonial states that had this sort of, various kinds of anxieties, definitely controlling people and, creating categories and trying to manage population. And we today talk about the biopower, which definitely was very, very central to many of those, the strategies, many of those strategies that the colonial governments followed all over the world. Now, it is in this context that we also come across the notion of histories which slip away in the context of archiving. So it has been famously argued by Gyanendra Pandey in one of his books, Unarchived Histories. He actually talks about histories. He actually takes this from Derrida's work, and he talks about how actually, in the process of archiving, there is a greater chance of a lot of things getting slipped off from being archived. So this is not something about a historical experience for which there will not be an archive, but it is a reference to the fact that in the context of archiving, it is quite possible that quite a lot of things will be slipped off. And there, when it happens, as Gyanendra Pandey had argued, so we may not get the trifling things. We may not get what he refers to as, something which borders madness, something which is part of the everyday, because there is every chance of people forgetting this everydayness of things, or the everyday occurrences, everyday experiences, because they have been so much part of our own lives and they got completely normalized. So therefore, we have another set of problems which unarchived histories open up. So there could be, one could talk about the histories of the marginalized, the histories of the domestic workers. This is an example which Pandey himself gives. Or one could talk about the subalterns in the racial context, the subalterns in the caste context. So we can proliferate this. So let's see how they escape from the the usual practice of archiving, because they don't fit in with the sort of the normal, which the colonial regime or the post-colonial regimes may want to have. And therefore, we come across historical examples of the archive which is not there, in certain ways, which have slipped off. And therefore, do we find this slip off archive in some other, say, repositories? It could be a very weird kind of way of asking this, because theoretically, when you want to talk about this unarchived histories, then it just slipped off, and then we can capture this by different modes, by very many different modes, but not necessarily as in a normal kind of archive. I'm pretty much not sure about this thing that I'm talking about, but what I want to open up is the possibility of seeing that stuff which could be otherwise referred to as unarchived, for a variety of reasons in some other kinds of collections. So this is something which can be contested, which can be argued about, and I'm sure that there will be people who would disagree with me. So in the context of some of my research, so Although I did not refer to them as unarchived at any point of time, so I have come across a great variety of archival materials on human experiences that have not been, let's say, archived in the state's archives, for example, that have not been part of the repository of the states, whether they are colonial state or post-colonial state. I'm referring here to some of the missionary archives that I'm familiar with. And I'm sure that with the initiative of scholars like Shiju Alex, we do have access to some great numbers of these missionary journals and many other kinds of collections in those online repositories. But I'm referring to, in addition to these online repositories which are open access, I'm referring to the normal kind of archive or organized as archives, institutionalized archives, which are not open access. Now, in those repositories, we actually come across very interesting kind of histories. If I want to use the term histories, or if I want to use the term ethnographies or social anthropologies of, for example, the everydayness of the lives of the marginalized social groups. But those things which I said had slipped off in a curious way, and maybe that usage of the word slipping off may not be right, but for the time being, I'm using this because of the fact that in certain ways, this particular life we do not come across in the state archive. Now, it doesn't mean that the state archive or the state repository doesn't have the kind of stuff related, any stuff related to these people. There are a lot. But what I'm saying is the chances of having very, very intimate accounts of the lives of the, say, for example, oppressed caste or Dalit communities in Kerala. So that is something which I worked on, or I have worked in this particular area using these kinds of archival materials, and I found that this, I just open up one question. In fact, in unarchived histories, one of the questions that was posed was the possibility of talking about the mentality of the people, or the possibility of talking about body as an archival repository, which is really difficult to talk about because we don't have human bodies being stored off in any place. There are no collections of that, we all know. But then the narratives on human body, which could be thought of as bearing the inscriptions of the everyday life. So those inscriptions are experiences. It can also be real inscriptions of whiplashes. And this is something that had happened, in the 19th century when, during the days of slavery, in Kerala, we had several instances of recorded documentation where people have been talking about the scars on the back, on the bare backs of both men and women. Now, what would this sort of inscription mean as far as human body is concerned? Can we write a history of this? I tried a little bit using the missionary archive to reflect on this particular question of how to decode this sort of, things, this sort of inscriptions on body. Are we looking at? Are we talking about the marks of chains on somebody's foot, or are we talking about the wound scars? Are we talking about the whiplash, the marks of the whiplashes, or the marks of continuous laboring in the field, or the marks left by, for example, the plows, when they were plowing the field, there are instances that's in fact in the colonial archive. Let me say like this: we have come across players being forced to plow the field. Then definitely they should have the mark of carrying this on their back, carrying the mark of the crossbar. So therefore, so it is not just the whiplashes, it's not just the mark of hard labor as they were forced to plow the field. So we have, quite a number of occasions where, let's say, often enough following, whatever is there in this archive, I'm not exaggerating things. Trying to read, trying to recollect my reading of this archive, which allows me to talk about in a historical and sociologically oriented way, to think about and to talk about, a body which had undergone pain, a body that had undergone sufferings, and so on. Now, do we have, an archival repository which will allow us to talk about this? Now, I'm not worried about this question, the narratives of pain and the narratives of hunger, for example. So I've been, wanting to talk about this at a later stage, but then since it came in connection with the discussion on body, I wish to state that, for example, we need to okay, I'm back, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, so I want to talk about this question of pain. Now, what are the ways in which we can, do this by looking at the kind of archive? There are several ways in which one can look at this. People do talk about, there are a lot of writings on the pain caused by separation, the pain caused by, real physical sufferings, diseases, malnutrition, and things of that kind. This is so much about pain and sufferings that we really encounter in the archival narratives. Now, what we need to think about is what actually enables this whole narrative of pain. That's what I was more interested in. What conditions were there that actually enabled such a engaging discussion on the question of pain? Then obviously in this particular narrative, and I found that people can disagree with me, there was an intertextuality of this pain with that of the pain of the Christ on the cross. So this is a kind of association that you read. So therefore, in the archive of the missionaries, we come across a number of things which we do not come across. For example, in the archives of the state or the archives of the social movements and so on. And now, before I just vanished a couple of minutes ago, I was referring to the question of hunger, for example. I was really startled by the way, for example, in this Malayalam novel, Nooru Simhasanangal, which I'm sure is familiar to all of us. And Mohan talks about people eating rice. Since we are in rice-eating cultures, we know that we eat great amount of rice almost every day. And then so he talks about the woman who eats rice and rice and rice and rice. And then it actually goes along with a narrative of hunger. And now in the context of some of the ethnographic fieldwork which I did, that is another archive which I have created in the course of my research. So we were talking to people about this particular thing and really requesting them to recall. And of course, it is part of, one could say in a fancy way, it was part of the history of mentalities and things of that kind. And then we requested them to talk about their experiences of hunger. And then we had an elderly person. She is no more. She passed away a couple of years ago. And she said even if we eat, we will be hungry. Even if we don't eat, we will be hungry. So whatever we eat, whether we eat or not, whether we have food or not, whether we eat enough food or not, the reality was that we were hungry all the time. So therefore, so there is. I'm not saying that nobody else were worried about this sort of narratives. No other repository will give you ideas about this. But for example, if you read the reports on famine, for example, if you take, there are narratives about these experiences, and people have already written about the experiences of people, undergoing that kind of severe experiences. But here we try to contextualize in an ethnographic manner the histories of hunger, the histories of that particular experience of what it is to be hungry. In its historical and sociological dimension, talking to a person who was at the time of our interview 92 years old. So then, there are a lot of narratives of that, wherein body becomes very, very central. So I'm talking about this particular series of interviews we had in one of the villages in the Kannur district, where in fact we met elderly people and did a lot of, ethnography. We did a lot of interviews. That was from 2015 onwards. Now, the point I want to emphasize is that these are everyday kinds of occurrences, everyday events. So it is so normalized, and it is very much there, as something which we can encounter, which people have encountered, and which they narrate to us. And what are the ways in which historians can talk about this? It is not that historians have not talked about it. So you read any standard economic history, any social history, we do come across interesting kind of exposition of this sort of experiences. But then we want to know, for example, how people recall this in a different context, how histories of this are being talked about, how it becomes part of their social memory. So this social memory gets re-articulated in the archive. For example, so I don't have much time to go into that. I just want to open up this. When we talk about the archive, and obviously we do, by default, actually we are talking about social memory, especially when our concern is, as I said, with those sort of the slipped off archival stuff, the kind of unarchived sort of histories when we talk about. Now, let me, as it is known to all of us here, one of the things is that it is not just out there, like history is not out there. So it is all constructed, obvious in the sense that it requires tremendous intellectual labor. The question of future progress and whatever the nation states wants to achieve in future. So for all these purposes, obviously we need this archive. But then when we come to the kind of archive that I referred to, the missionary archive, obviously it has a very particular kind of intention, which is political, cultural dimensions built into that. But beyond that, beyond this kind of compulsions, we do come across the interstices situations, things, or the kind of ideas that gets articulated and re-articulated, which is, to my mind, is quite not just useful, it is absolutely important for critical historians and social scientists. That's why I took a couple of examples, the question of body, the question of pain, suffering, hunger, and things of that kind. And now, therefore, we have the whole idea of certain kind of politics involved in this production of the archive. Now, quickly, in what I said in the beginning, I just want to signpost some of the work which I did some time ago in relation to the kind of archive that I have come across. So we did sometime back in 2010, worked along with the British Library London to work in the area of endangered archives. And for those who are interested in this, is there for a free download from the British Library London's archive. If you type endangered archives, so then you get this. So we tried actually to look at broadly colonialism, social movements, and the creation of documents, exploring the archives of Dalits and other low caste groups in Kerala. So this was a kind of project which we did. And as part of this particular work, in fact, the colleagues who worked along with me, they were some of them were my own students at the School of Social Sciences, Binoy Abraham, and another person was a former student and a PhD in modern history, Binimol Abraham. She's now with the Assumption College at Changalasheri. So we went to many places in Kerala, up to the north, Kannur district. We met with many people who were part of social movements of various kinds, religious movements, etc., and collected a huge amount of paper materials on paper, ranging from late 19th century to, so because this project has to end around 1960s, 70s. So that was the time scale which we had. So we tried to collect a great variety of archival materials of different social movements. And now, what is the idea of archive in the community? That's the point which I want to open up. The other things, as those of us in professional history, teaching, research, etc., we are familiar with. But now let us look at what does archive mean to the ordinary people. Ordinary in the sense that I use this word just to mention that they are not part of any historical research or anything of that kind. They are really there as ordinary people. So there is a great deal of owning up of these source materials. As professional researchers, we refer to them as source materials. But in fact, for the people who are custodians of these particular documents, so they consider it as very, very precious. In fact, when we went and met the office bearers of this interesting Dalit social movement, DCUF, so they were of the opinion that they thought that this was something prophesied by the founder of the movement, the late Sabaraj Tirumeni. That's how he said this. So the people said that, the secretary of the movement whom we met, they said they were looking forward to somebody coming as prophesied by the founder of the movement, that they will come and ask for this material. So these materials were an assortment of, documents, including police cases, cases filed in the local police stations, or cases running in the courts at that point of time, or a variety of representations, letters, private purpose, land documents. So we have a number of documents of that kind, which were included in the collection of this particular social movement. Now, what I want to suggest is that the people have a sense of the archive. This is the point. So obviously the kind of stuff that we have talked about, archival anxieties, why they have actually conserved these materials, and how do they conserve? You see, we don't assume them to keep them in good chests, like in good archives. In these days, they are all most of them are air conditioned, including the archives in Kerala. They are all, put in good conditions and so on. And not to speak of the archival repositories in Europe. In Europe, so you have materials kept in, chests which are in air-conditioned storage places, in air-conditioned storages. The collections are in such storages. And now for these people, as I said, very ordinary people who have been conserving these materials. So they have got a very different orientation to this. I cannot say whether it is like writing could enslave, people. I mean, if you write something that is the best way to enslave others. So there is a dictum which we have read in Levi-Strauss and so many other kinds of ways in which the idea of writing writing has been talked about. Writing has the power to entice. Probably at some point of time, the people who have been preserving this, sometimes they have been preserving the notices announcing the meetings of this particular movement. So we have come across several such instances. People have been attributing a certain kind of aura to this sort of repository, this sort of documents, this sort of, what we refer to as archival materials. So these materials have got an enticing quality. They have got kind of quality which is beyond the humdrum everyday life, beyond the kind of stuff that we come across in our everyday life, and they feel that these are very, very powerful documents, and the preservation of that is some kind of a divinely ordained thing. So as far as this particular movement is concerned, so we do have many other secular movements, especially we have been working with the archive collections of the Dalit communities, and the people have got definitely a very different kind of attitudes towards these archival materials. And these archival materials that I am referring to have been, preserved in whatever, and I'm not very sure many of those things that we have come across in 2010-11 should be there after the floods. It's quite likely that much of it must have gone for good. Now, fortunately, we have got this using this sort of narratives. So therefore, what happens is that, and also we have feminist scholarship on partition, on that particular field, Urvashi Bukhari and many others, and I'm sure that historians are aware of this sort of things. Obviously, we are dealing with very, things which are not a couple of centuries old. We are dealing with quite issues of modern history, contemporary history. But the other point, without taking much time, is to look at the ways in which people can give you information of such histories which might take you to the late 19th century or early 20th century. So my experience has been that, doing this sort of histories, ethnographically oriented histories with local communities, our idea was to look not exactly for absolute truth, that was not the concern, but to see, depending on the kind of ideas that we have from the archive and other kinds of sources, to see how far there could be approximations to truth. And therefore, I think as researchers, we can, drawing on the kind of writings that are already there. I think there are ways of managing this. Thank you. I don't know if I have given you an answer. Yeah.
Okay, one more question on a very related area. Collaboration of oral sources and archival data are important for clear historical interpretations. What type of collaborations are needed?
Archival and ethnographic, right?
Archival and oral sources.
Oral sources, okay. Collaboration of. Yeah, so what I suggested is just this. You see, now it depends on what sort of research that you do or what sort of research X or Y does. But the point is, we actually, if somebody is doing a lot of archival research, and of course, in the case of some people, there will be the luxury of going back to the field and verifying this. But in the case of some other research teams or some other people, this may not be a possibility. And now for those who can do this, going back to the field and verify these and look at these kinds of things. Now, what I can tell you is a very interesting kind of example. So I just mentioned in the course of my presentation one of the reports that I have come across, which is about, which is actually generated at this residence office. Actually, it went actually to the residence office in Trivandrum. This was about the history of slavery in Kerala. And some of which are some selections of that particular document you find reproduced in Professor Sharada Mani's very interesting and important book, Emergence of a Slave Caste Palace of Kerala. So you have reproductions of that. But I have come across some stuff which are part of this but not included in this book. This is about the example of a Pulaya man being forced to plow the field along with a bull. So this is actually available in the report. It is written like that. Yeah. So I have this particular report in my collection. And now when we went to the field, we had a lot of narratives about people talking about their grandparents. One of this person's grandfather. This I can tell you. In fact, 2016 when we did field work in one of the villages of migrant Dalit Christians in Kannur. So one of these persons told us the story, and we tried to work backwards the chronology. Then the event must have happened sometime between 1910 and 17, when his grand uncle, so this man who is narrating his story, who narrated this story, heard this from his father when his father was 17 years old. He was a witness to the fact that his uncle, who went for grazing the cattle of the landlord, and he lost one bull. And then when he came back, this man was punished, and subsequently he was killed. His head was cut off. So we work backwards this chronology of this narrative, 1910 and 17. So the offense was that this is an ox which is used as a draught animal, no, so plowing the field, and now losing an animal which is used for harnessing the plow means it's an economic loss to this landlord. And then he asked this man who took the cattle for grazing to perform the work, and which he did, and he fainted and he fell down the next day. So then he gets killed. Now this is narrated by the person's son who witnessed this. The person who witnessed was 17 years when this had happened. But the person who got killed was quite an elderly man. Now this had happened in a village not very far from Kaduthurthi in Kottayam. Yeah, so it's not something which has happened in thousands of years ago. It's something happened recently. Now, so when I do this particular narrative, what I want to emphasize is just this. So I have read this in the mid 19th century report. See, actually that report was, sometime in 1875, I think. So little over a couple of decades after the abolition of slavery in Travancore and Cochin. So they were reporting back the histories of that and also saying what has happened to the people who were liberated. So therefore, to preface this history, they brought in some of this historic information about people being forced to plow the field. Now, I'm giving you an example from the early 20th century where similar things have happened, and this particular thing we heard in the narrative of a person whom we have interviewed. What is the the challenging thing for historians here, or someone who is doing critical social sciences? The challenging thing, even as we know that it is true, to see that how over a period of time this image has not changed, and how a person is being treated like an animal. Because if you look at the early 20th century narratives of not just government, even including missionaries, there was a tendency still in the early 20th century to refer to this sort of oppressed social groups as living in the conditions of cattle. Yeah, so therefore, piece together all this information. What is being talked in the public domain, this kind of reports that you've come across in the newspapers, the narratives available in the communities, and the narrative available in the archive. Bring all of them together, and then you have got a fantastic material. I mean, fantastic. I'm not saying that it's it is fantastic minus the human tragedies. Human tragedies are the central questions around which that history will be written about. You have the blood, the pain, the body, and all of this, a heady cocktail of all this, I should say. But then, yeah, so that is how we can bring in this. So I just gave an example, that how I encountered this. But likewise, and I'm sure that we need to read these oral narratives critically, and the possibility of accretion, the additions to that, the possibilities of weaning away stuff from oral narratives and so on, and think of oral narratives as something in the process of creation. People can add on to this, people can take away this, but then, as far as these narratives of pain, sufferings, etc. are concerned, we do find this still existing in communities. Sometimes people are not ready to talk about it. Yeah, so therefore I just leave it here. So you just email me, I can give you more kind of stuff.
Okay, we can pass on to the next question. The question is from raised by Abhijit, who is a research scholar in the Department of
I have one thing to tell you. MT, you
Okay.
can restrain me because we have the habit of talking a lot, the time. Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, the next question is from Abhijit, and the question says, can slavery and spatial marginalization in coastal and hilly tracts be learned from archival sources other than in the agricultural field? What are the other sources if archival sources are not available?
Oh, okay, so I presume it is related to Kerala, this question, right? What I understand is that mostly slavery and similar forms of unfreedom existed in the midland to lowlands of Kerala, where there was this landlordism of different kind. But in the hill tracts, if you look at the kind of statistics that we have, even in the even before, I guess, let's say by 1930s, large chunks of those places were hills and forested. So we do not come across such huge amount of settled population there. But in the case of Wayanad, we read about communities such as Paniyas and Adiyas, etc., being enslaved, etc. But then it has a but I think even I had chance to see some of the local histories. I mean, as north as that of Alladam Sarupam, where again people talk about slavery existing in the the rice field. Rice in the areas where rice production was there, and also from the researches of my friend Dinesh V. He also talks about this sort of things existing. In fact, I just came across some of the late 19th century documents where, in fact, in a village named Eramam in Kannur district, we read about an incident of a clash between 50 players and 50 knights. So the amazing statistics of this, conflict in which equal number of knights and players were involved, and players receiving wounds, knights also receiving wounds, and so on. So, but eventually, players were overpowered. This is sometime, I guess, in 1865. This was reported in Calcutta Review. So therefore, you see, from the extreme north of Kerala to down south, we do have in the wetland tracts, this sort of things. In fact, my friend Dr. K.S. Madhavan, in his research on the early medieval period, also talks about the existence of, the kind of unfreedom. So, a kind of rough and ready answer that I can suggest is that most of these sort of enslavement and things of that kind were confined to the midlands and lowlands, including both wetland agriculture as well as dryland farming. These sort of things existed. Now, therefore, I think when we want to look at slavery, I think these are the geographical locations as far as Kerala is concerned. Now, I have come across English documents wherein they talk about slave markets. For example, there's a place named Ainikad. So then I talk to people here, and at least there are 3 Ainikads. One in 2 in Pathanamthitta district, I guess, and one is near Pale. But one of these documents, the English documents, where it is, where it talks about slave market, it refers to Ainikad as a place where one could buy slaves. People sell slaves there. But most published materials that are available in secondary sources and also primary sources, we come across a number of places where slave markets existed in Kerala. So therefore, you can have this sort of interesting information already available there, and one can actually create a map of this. The slave markets and other kinds of things. We don't have such a map, but it is quite possible that they can plot all these places and mark out the places where slave market existed, etc. So therefore, I just want to say this. But the other point I want to say quickly is that I have seen, but I'm yet to get that book. Most recently, some of the Dutch scholars based in Germany, they have translated some of the Dutch materials into English and brought out a book wherein they talk about the lives of slaves during Dutch period. So I think that book has 10 or 15 such biographies. And I have come across biographies of enslaved people fighting for their rights. So this is around the middle of the 19th century, fighting court cases and so on. So a lot of stuff of that kind, a lot of stuff in the sense that these are not thousands of cases or hundreds of cases. Maybe you have a few scores of cases where documentation exists. But in all this, and I guess these are people who were part of the wetland agriculture or dryland farming, mostly, midland and coastal, not on the sea coast, So midland and the lowland areas of Kerala. I don't know if I have given the right answer. Thank you. As I said, you can email and respond.
Okay, the next question is from Rachel Varghese. She writes, aspects like pain and hunger are often accessed through ethnography, including forms like songs, as you have done in your work. Such kind of archive is not
from... Can you read the first part again?
Yes, definitely. Aspects like pain and hunger are often accessed through ethnography, including forms like songs, as you have done in your work. Such kind of archive is not frozen. It has an accumulative character whereby experiential history piles upon them over time. My query is, What are the ways to understand the temporal dynamism of such archives as a potential rather than a limitation?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question to answer. Now, what Rachel said is very correct. So we have this sort of experiential, stuff being narrated in songs, etc., etc. Now, she was referring to the last part of it is about the temporality of that, no? Empty? If I can you repeat the last part of it?
Yes, yes. My question is, what are the ways to understand the temporal dynamism of such archives as a potential rather than a limitation?
Now, I think that is a potential. The temporality of that is a potential because the fact that we can actually have a lot of narratives of this hunger. Even subsequently, I mean, even in the 20th century, we do have this kinds of narratives. Even today, I am sure that even as we are talking now, as we have people who are really suffering in this pandemic situation. So it's quite possible that I mean, obviously we are not going and collecting this sort of information, but the sufferings that the COVID-19 has created. I mean, that has also induced hunger, that has also induced pain, and so on. So, I think that the temporal dimension of this, it goes back in time, and also at another level, I think these are very, very thick kind of narratives where we come across a lot of emotions being, articulated. People talk about this in a very powerful way, and I think that becomes a strength of that. Which also gives us some insights into how actually people survive in spite of all this. We are not saying that people have thrown away their the ideas of future, the expectations that people had. So that's why, in spite of all this, this is something that we also need to recall, which I'm sure that as researchers in history we know, or in other social sciences, that even amidst hardship, we find people, keeping on. People do hold on to, certain kind of expectations. They hold on to a future. They expect a future. So, which is what sometimes, the what you call the solidarities of these oppressed people talk about. Even amidst all this scarcity, all these sufferings, we come across quite a number of ways in which people really try to come out of this sort of situations. And even if it is sort of their life, we still see possibilities of people coming out of that. So they hold actually, some kind of expectation as far as future is concerned. So this we have come across in our research in one of the local communities here in Kottayam, the village Manjadikeri, about which we have published some stuff. So in our ethnographic sort of research, which I did along with many other colleagues of mine, Dr. P. Madhu and many others, and of course our research students also. So they have collected this very interesting information about how people survive the hardships, sufferings, and so on. So therefore, this whole idea of a possible future was very much there. Which it is also interesting, but it might be a far-fetched example. But so excuse me for that. See, in spite of all this, possibly we do not find large numbers of suicide. I do not know if we have data to make this argument. But I'm sure we have people like Anuj and others listening to me. I believe these are people who do a lot of archival research. It is also important to look at this sort of things because under conditions of extreme rural sufferings in the last 15 to 20 years, we have had millions of peasant suicides. Not millions, in fact, a few lakhs of people. Maybe it is little over a million people. So please correct me if I'm wrong. We have had several people committing suicide, but under colonial conditions or under conditions of slavery, obviously people were committing suicide. We know that, but not in the manner in which we have suicides in the last few years in India. And now, in the context of slavery, so we have come across a lot of narratives of people entering forests so that they thought some wild animals will eat them up and they will die and then the sufferings will be over. Or, that sort of things are there. But yet, I don't know, believe me, this is what I think. We do not come across, communities losing faith in future. So I may be completely wrong, but this is a very provisional kind of argument I'm making. So therefore, I guess still there was something to fall back upon. Maybe that was how people survived. So anyway, so thank you, Rachel, for that. So this temporality, I think, is a possibility. I don't know if I have answered Rachel correctly, but and of course, Rachel can write to me for it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Meenu Rebecca. Meenu Rebecca is a research fellow in the Department of History of Sanskrit University. And she asks, how politics and policies influenced the subject matter of missionary bulletins and magazines, the role of censorship, and how missionary groups publicized and disseminated their journals. That is the missionary propaganda in doing so.
Yeah, this is what people ask me. And I have become a missionary in the course of answering this. Now, listen, any historical writing, for that matter, can be imbued with certain qualities of propaganda. Like, for example, if you read the colonial government's records, reports, and so on, I think there is a lot more propaganda involved in this. So, only that much propaganda is there in missionary writings. Now, when you write an economic history, in spite of all the, you see, there are a number of people who have worked in the area of the history of Malabar or Travancore, or broadly the economic history of modern India and so on. So, the colonial information is the bedrock of most of this sort of research works that we have. So there is a normal critique of the sources. You go into the fundamentals of the ideas by which these source materials have been generated. Or if you want to look at, how, for example, colonial capitalism flourished here and all sorts of such things that political economists write about or economic historians write about. They do depend on huge amounts of colonial data, archival data from colonial sources. Now, if you think those sources are biased, so the point is to look at the knowledge which enable the production of those reports. This is what is important. And that is how analytical history will go forward. Rather than citing one report, citing some facts here, some facts there. Of course, those are important and we need to do that. But the most important question is, as researchers, are we aware of the politics of the production of these sources that we use? If you say that, if we are, the same thing applies to missionary sources. So these are sources, which are produced in a particular context, and those who reported this had their own ideas about what the social life should be, what should be the kind of life that the people who have joined their congregations should lead, how should be their moral life, how should be their moral perceptions, and how should be their everyday life, what should be the kind of stuff that they eat, which nobody could really tell them, because if you go by the missionaries' own narratives, our narratives in the missionary writings, you will see that most people who joined the mission had a very poor life. They were not, having fantastic meals every day. It was not like that. So therefore, any problem that you find in any kind of colonial sources of history or archival information applies in many ways to this sort of materials. If you call them as propaganda, you call this as propaganda. If you say that there is a lot of politics into that, lot more politics. I mean, similar kind of things are there. Now, the point I want to emphasize is the most significant thing. In fact, we today have large numbers of historians and social anthropologists all across the world, actually using missionary sources to write about the colonial histories. And in fact, I guess these are very in the last 20 years, perhaps, you have, for instance, I just invite your attention to a very interesting article by one of the Australian scholars, Encounters with the Enemy, Academic Readings of Missionary Narratives on Melanesians. So this was by Bronwyn Douglas, social anthropologist of Australian National University. And similarly, the writings of Komarovs or J.D.Y. Peel and so many others, some of these materials have been using. So the long and short of it is that those of us in India who use these materials and the other scholars using these materials elsewhere, they are aware of the dimensions of power, dimensions of knowledge, domination, etc., that are built into this. But you cannot write sometimes the histories of indigenous people without taking this into account. So I have spoken to people writing about the histories of Aborigines or the First Nation people of Canada using the CMS materials. And I also know that subaltern studies scholars like David Hardiman have been using this sort of material. So there is, it is not something confined to a particular group of historians or social anthropologists alone using this. Now these archives are open. And, of course, online stuff is quite expensive. So therefore, those who use these materials definitely know about the politics of that. And also the kind of connections between colonialism, missionizing, the missionary organizations, etc., etc. And therefore, people are writing, people are using this sort of materials, using these narratives in a critical way. Now, that criticism is not like to say, okay, these guys have been writing because they were apologists of colonialism. No. So that's a very, very preliminary, primary kind of idea about what these materials are all about. So beyond that, and you move away from that, you need to really know how categories of analysis have been created here. For example, when you say suffering body, where does it come from? So these are the these are the kind of ideas which are important there. Or I can give you any number of examples to show that, this is the stuff which is being talked about today. And yeah, so for want of time, I stop here. Now, please.
Okay. Okay, the next question is from Nandini Jana.
Yeah.
The question is, what kind of questions need to be posed by a historian in doing ethnographic researches?
Okay. This is ethnography and history, I guess. Now, see, now I have very good examples to give you. See, if you are familiar with Nandini Sundar's writing, Subalterns and Sovereigns, that's a fantastic book. She's not a historian. She's a social anthropologist. Now, if you read that book, and you see a lot of history has gone into that. Yeah. So, and even someone like M.N. Srinivas, if you read that Rampura book or any of those stuff, then you see that there is a kind of historically informed kind of stuff in it. And in fact, even in these writings of Anne Stoller I referred to, she actually talks about even Spitzer's kind of comment that social anthropologists have to, undergo what he referred to as a certain kind of historical turn. I mean, obviously, this historical turn kind of phrase is a new one, but then the idea was that the social anthropologists have to do a lot of archival historical research and so on. And therefore, one of the things, and also if you read books like Writing Culture, this is one of those fantastic book on ethnography. Then you see that many ethnographers have been doing historical research, or they do tend to use the methodology of historians. Now, what comes to my mind is one book, Culture and Truth. This is by one of those very interesting social anthropologists. Oh, come on, I forgot his name. It will come back to me. So in Culture and Truth, Renato Rosaldo, he talks about a very interesting kind of stuff in which even he actually finds fault with the founding figures in social anthropology who thought that they are doing fantastic work. They go to this far-flung esoteric communities and they do their field work, and they do come out with their kind of narrative. They do write about all this, whether it is Malinowski or the people of that generation who did research in far-off corners of the world, and they do write about this. But Renato Rosaldo says that the latter-day disciples of these great names in social anthropology, they have disproved the arguments of their own masters, their own teachers. The point is simple. The way you understand another culture need not be really the way the people, have been imbuing meaning to those practices. Anthropologists can go wrong. Ethnographers could commit mistakes. But this has been argued by latter-day students of this sort of great figures in social anthropology. Now, when historians do ethnographic research, what will happen is that they go with a certain kind of idea because historians often work with, obviously, even if we are not doing the long duty kind of research, we do have in mind at least a couple of centuries or even 50, let's say 50 years. In some universities, I know it is mandatory that your title should have some years. Some of my friends doing PhD in some other places, they come out with this kinds of fantastic titles with some fictitious date over there. And I ask them, why the hell you have this date? They say, 1947 because India became independent. Nothing must have changed for the kind of stuff he is or she is doing as far as, in 1947, it was completely untouched by what this 1947 was all about. So, but therefore, history has to toe the line of a certain kind of nationalism, then they, for nation state, they do it like that. So therefore, historians have a fixation with time, yet ethnographers are doing very, very contemporary things. But then ethnographic problem can be of a long duty. So therefore, there should be a right mix of this. Ethnographic sensitivity, you want to talk about ethnographic experience like done by masters in the field, like you are narrating, something like you're giving a thick description of the culture that you are studying. These are the kind of ideas that ethnographers may have. But then what will happen? Historians always think that these source materials are there and they are great and you're going to write a great history. And even if you employ ethnographic methods, you may not question this. Now, here is a classic example where this is my last point in relation to this, where again, Renato Rosaldo critiques Laduri. So it is about, I think the book, one of the books, I think it's about Mandalu, and also some other writings, where they have used these inquisitorial evidences inquisitorial evidence are produced under duress. And now if historian is using this kind of materials produced out of duress, then naturally the evidence given by the informant, so that word is wrong. It's not informant, it's a person who is tortured, like in the case of Ginsburg's Miller. So you have this fantastic book by Carlo Ginsburg, where the Cheese and Wormsburg, he talks about the Miller's history. He is tortured to give evidence. So likewise, when this sort of informant, for want of another word, I'm using this, if he is tortured to give evidences, that evidences are covered, I mean, the very process of creating evidence is colored by the physical torture. And if a historian doesn't understand this particular situation of the production of sources, Rosaldo says, then it is a failed affair. So therefore, there is a dialogue between social anthropologists, ethnographers, and historians. And now, to my mind, that's very productive. I mean, any disciplinary practice definitely have its own problems. No disciplinary practice in terms of academic research is free from these problems. And yet, I guess if you can really do ethnographic research along with this sort of historical thing that you do, I mean, that could be quite productive at the end of the day. I mean, obviously, it depends on what sort of thing, what sort of question that you are exploring. Yeah.
Okay. Next, Dr. Tanu Parashar of University of Delhi asks, Sir, can you elaborate the significance of proscribed literature available in archives in terms of topics or concepts of contemporary relevance? In what ways one can use them alongside primary sources? Can you give some example in connection to the same proscribed literature?
Yeah, so I understand it, but in my research, I have not used any of that, but obviously I can reflect on this. You see, there are a lot of things which I think this, the kind of the process of prescribing some published material, book, or some kind of political pamphlets, etc., actually is the work of the state of the time, or whatever the political powers be of that time. Now, definitely, we can use these books. In our own times, for example, see quite a number of literary productions or literatures literary works were proscribed by the state. Various states still do that. And in the colonial period, definitely there were a lot of banning of books, pamphlets, etc. And now we can use these materials to talk about, for example, in a sense, let's take the examples of the literatures, or pamphlets and books produced by the Communist Party of India during the the freedom. The latter part of the freedom struggle at that period. What actually we can read in this proscribed literature is the very idea of offering a critique to the dominant state or the colonial authorities, etc. So that is one possibility of reading. And of course, if you really explore the political ideas, you may want to talk about the context of these ideas and who were articulating those ideas, and why the state was not very happy with this, or why the state thought that this is kind of literature that is going to destabilize the state's longevity and things of that kind. And now even today, for example, in this particular instance in Kerala, relating to the early 20th century banning of Swadeshabhimani Ramakrishna Pilla's press, and also he was being sent out of the, he was taken out of Travancore, and he was packed off from Travancore as he was asking difficult questions to the Travancore state, and many others, in the subsequent periods in various parts of India. political radicals have experienced this sort of situations. And now when we have this literature or even any form of printed material which was proscribed, that actually tell us about the the intellectual life of the people who have actually produced those materials, etc. And also to see how there was a reception to these materials, how people were ready to read these materials, and why there was a reception to that. We can ask similar questions, and then you will see that there was a heightened presence of these materials in the public sphere, in the way people were discussing, the way people were forming their ideas and so on, or largely forming a critique of the existing powers. In the case of India, most of it should have been against the British government at that point of time. And therefore, we should also look at the circulation of this, how people were reading them, and the sort of ideas which were, communicated through these kinds of proscribed literature. And I think this is one way of looking at it. And now, in fact, my last point is connected with some of the contemporary things. Like Donny Vendiger's book was banned in India. And similar, I mean, even earlier there were, banning of books of that kind. So it actually talks about the desire of the state to control the thinking, which is not going to happen in any case, because these days there are chances of getting the electronic versions of the book, such so-called proscribed literatures. Yeah, so therefore I think we need to look at it from the political perspective as well as from the perspective of the history of ideas.
Okay. Next is from Kunjuni Sajiv. Sir, what is your opinion in using archaeology along with ethnography in producing alternative histories?
Now, of course, I guess those scholars who work with archaeological materials or artifacts and so on, I mean, it is very much part of this the professional history writing. But I'm sure that I used to hear very critical comments from my friend Dr. Rachel Varghese when I made these kinds of abrasive comments. And following what she told me in the last couple of years about archaeological and I mean that particular discipline and the knowledge produced there. So archaeological disciplinary training is rightful thing in its own right, and we know that it is a knowledge domain having its own kind of protocols and so on. And historians might use the insights from there, but and I guess archaeology has got its own kind of academic standing as a different discipline, although historians use this. So I think we should give that, we means those of us in history. And yeah, so even for us in modern, I do research in modern history. And there are quite a number of avenues of working along with archaeologists, using their insights and working along with them. For example, we had some discussions on looking at the spatiality of contemporary politics, using insights from archaeology, where you talk about the questions of space and how space is created, controlled, and also artifacts, and also the ideas. I mean, Rachel should excuse me for saying this. The ways in which one can talk about things which are not there. So therefore, I think it is not just informing history. So my association with my colleagues in archaeology has informed me heavily that archaeologists develop their own kind of questions which in fact historians might be a better position to, it is better for historians to really learn from archaeologists rather than treating it as kind of, that's like, ancillary discipline and stuff of that kind, I guess is an old sort of an argument. My association with some of the well-known archaeologists, right here as well as elsewhere, has told me that they do ask questions which are connected with ethnography. In fact, I worked with an archaeologist to look at the contemporary ethnography of fishing communities of Kerala, which we did some work a couple of years ago. The other collaborator was an archaeologist. So therefore, I guess these are really challenging kind of things where we learn from the academic practices of each of these disciplines. That is how I look at this. Thank you.
Okay. Next is from Amit Varghese. The question is, what is your take on the concept of living archives and how important it is in the writing of the present and past?
I don't know much about it. I will be happy to listen to this concept of living archives. So if you can explain it further, and probably we can have a conversation on that.
Okay, that we can postpone. The next question by Chitran.
Read on this. Yeah.
Okay. The next question from Chitran. Were the technologies of punishment deployed on the bodies of marginalized and Dalit communities in the princely states of Travancore and Cochin, guided by colonial notions of power? Do you have experiences of encountering such narratives in the archives of Trivandrum and Kochi?
Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting kind of question. I have come across some reporting of this, but mostly outside Kerala. I meant to look for this sort of materials in the state archives, but some work which I did just before the COVID-19 closed down the archive, the state archives in Trivandrum. So there are references to the systems of punishment and so on. And some of these materials are actually reprinted in, subsequently reprinted in already circulating books. And the corporal punishment was very much there. That was, sort of thing which would evoke fear in the minds of the people. But we also know that capital punishment was not awarded to upper caste, and the killing was mostly reserved for the low caste people. And there was a lot of technologies by which this instruments of punishments could be utilized, and the ways in which punishments could be meted out to people. And I think apart from the state, that happens, I guess, subsequently when Travancore state was modernized. But before that, the state also punished, along with that, the local potentates, especially the landowning groups also were controllers of violence. So therefore, you find people being killed, people being mutilated, people being drowned, or they are being buried in pits, head propping up, and leaving some oil on their head, inviting ants to eat them up. So I have come across a lot of narratives of that kind, and also this whole practice of human sacrifice. So human sacrifice used to be there, and in fact, I think it was this was something which was there throughout. And in fact, one researcher who shared her MPhil level research is Dr. Tracy Vallikapan. She was very kind to me to share her MPhil level study, which was based on Kuttanad region in Kerala, where she had tried to document through field work, which of course a few things I also knew before reading this, but the ways in which you have this sort of, I lots of such people were killed and buried. So this was actually because of the thoughts that the souls of these people that's killed would become what you call the guardian spirits of the paddy fields. And these guardian spirits will protect the paddy outer bunch of the fields from breaching. So Kutanadam Kasharatulali, Kasharatulali Prasthana. That's the history of the agricultural laborers movement, Kutanad
Okay,
Dr. Sanal, have you lost him?
it's not audible.
So we come across similar narratives in various sources. So therefore, my last point is that this corporal punishment or the death penalty, capital punishment, and other forms of physical torture, there were different power centers for them, different agencies involved in this. The upper class landlords would be doing this, and there was a lot of violence. And this, in addition to this structural violence, the possibilities evoking fear in the minds of the enslaved. So all of this was there, but in spite of all this, we also come across resistances. But it was highly localized, but nothing like the kind of slave revolts or slave rebellion or let's say resistance in a very big way. Nothing of that kind. Yeah.
Yes, the last question in the chat box is from Nisha Dangamali. How far an archival research can re-engage with the normalized notion of slave morality in many unacknowledged fields of contemporary regimes?
You see, what I have come across is that slave morality is not used as a negative thing. That's what my impression is all about. So it says that the slave knows much about the master than perhaps what the master knows about the slave. And then he has an idea about, or she has an idea about, what the society, that slave society is all about. Now, I think the contemporary society, people use it in a very different way, but the sense in which the original phrasing, what I have read it is like this, that the slave knows much about the master, or the master classes, the slaves would know more about that. And based on that, that particular group can have their own kind of ideas about society, etc., etc. So therefore, I'm pretty much unsure about how you contemporary context. But I will be happy to listen to you. And if I'm wrong, I'll absolutely happy to correct myself at this point of time.
Dr. YouTube chat box. I'll quickly ask this. This is Professor Rao Yenda. He says that I believe that the state archives and the missionaries' archives have perhaps for the first time provided evidence to the history of the other. Did you hear me, sir?
Yeah. I can hear you, definitely. Yes, in certain ways, yes, because you see, it's not that this information was academic programs. We come across reference to all this, but the ways in which you have an absolutely fantastic narrative, a detailed narrative, I guess we come across only in the writings of the missionaries. The reason being that they were the ones who actually went and met with these people. And now, if even in the, for example, even in the early decades of 20th century, when in Travancore, for instance, the local government asked the Pravartikar of Changanasheri to report about Poigel Johannan's movement, for example. But they didn't have an idea to go and meet up with this person who was very much there. But they asked some local guys to go and meet, one of the local officials, and then he commissions another guy and gets this information from a person. I mean, the person about whom they were seeking information was very much there, but they never went and asked him, "What are you doing here? What are you saying? What are your ideas?" Nothing of that sort. But it is the other way around. But then they wrote to the Bishop of Kottayam. That is the Travancore and Cochin missions bishop, CMS bishop. They wrote to him, and this Reverend Bishop wrote an extensive letter. Through the information that they have gathered through the the network of the church, so they reported back. So what I'm saying is, even as the colonial government documents gave us a lot of information, when it comes to a very interesting kind of narrative about what actually is happening to the people, I guess it is the missionaries who gave that. So I don't know if there is time to recall story, because historians' stories are always long. I cut short. But I draw your attention to one of the mid-19th century narrative where one of those Pulaya families had a very tragic death of two children. One boy died earlier, and subsequently another boy, but only this family was converted, quote unquote. But others were not Christianized. So the uncle of this boy said, "Well, you guys lost a child because you are leaving the ancestral gods. And now another one is lost, and look how this is visiting us. These hardships are visiting us. Therefore, you guys don't conduct this burial in your Christian way. Leave it to us." And he was so insistent that even Reverend Umman Maman, very venerable, priest of that time, and he said to the bereaved parents that you leave the body of the young boy to his uncle. Then the uncle comes and he does the so-called the quote-unquote heathen way of burying this child, right? And giving offerings of tender coconut and all of this stuff, which would be done in the Pulaya way. Now, this is a very emotionally charged narrative. When I wrote some piece on history of emotions in this context, I used this example. But then the other aspect is the ethnographic narrative of the burial among heathen Pulayans. That's how it was titled, actually. But then you really need to read this differently, which will enable you to look at the emotionally charged atmosphere of that. So therefore, cutting short, so you are right. So there is a lot more of this sort of narrative, quite first-hand information in it. And I think, yes, this is one significant source of information. Thank you.
The next question is from Dr. Vinita Menon. Can the historical processes of the construction of everyday realities of caste and race, pain, body, etc., be elicited from archival material?
Yeah, thank you very much, teacher. It was nice listening to you, your question. Well, I think we need to be opening up to all sorts of possibilities. So there, I guess, the critical question will be how far historians will be ready to do this thick description kind of narrative. That alone, that can help us, to say more about this. And so therefore the challenge is to really read this historical documents in an ethnographic and social anthropological way. If I did not miss the central piece of the question. So that is how I look at this. Shiva, did I get the question well? Could you please
Yes, sir.
repeat? Yeah.
The last question is from Dr. Leena Abraham.
Yeah.
Are the experiences of slavery vastly different in the case of Pania Adia communities
Yeah.
and community?
Well, it was different because I said, you see, in fact, I listened to some young people. Unfortunately, I forgot her name. She was a researcher at Malayalam University. I forgot the department as well, but she is doing a fantastic work on Adia community, their narrative, their histories, and so on. And she told me, interestingly, sometimes some of you listening to me would know, they refer to themselves differently, not as Adia actually now, and they also try to suggest their history back in the Kannada region. So they also talk about some kind of historic migration and stuff of that kind. And now, having said this, obviously, I wish to suggest that these have been different because these are communities, especially in the case of Adir, they are confined to Wayanad, if I am not mistaken. But for the in the case of the Paniyas, we have them in mostly in Wayanad, then Kannur and Calicut, and maybe a little bit in Malappuram, and possibly in a sparsely distributed population in the northern districts of Kerala. But they had the long history of proletarianization. In fact, the village where I grew up, we had Paniya community right over there in Kannur district. So in Ayyangunna Arlam village, there are a lot of Paniyas. But these were people who were actually the laborers of landlords there, especially these Muslim Jennis and some of the Devasams which had land there, and they were clearing forests. Sometime maybe it was in 1930s, 40s, that time when migration subsequently took place. So the Paniyas were providing physical labor for all this clearing of forest and so on. But we also know the kind of enslaving that has been happening at Valliyur Kav, kind of pledging of labor and things of that kind. This sometimes it might appear as the kind of debt bondage, but I'm not very sure to qualify this as a debt bondage because you don't see many communities doing this. It was mostly Paniyas who would, I think, do this. That's what I read in some of the published materials. And therefore, I guess we need to look at these peculiarities of the Adivasi communities in Wayanad, different from all the foothills of Wayanad bordering Kannur, bordering Kannur, Kannur and Calicut districts. So their histories, I'm sure, was pretty much different from that of the communities that were serving as, enslaved laborers, although that category labor is not very good there, although they were laboring, but the protocols of that labor was definitely different, and therefore I wish to draw a line of demarcation there. But my point quickly is this. The enslaved communities who were part of the systems of agricultural production in the plains of Kerala, as well as foothills of the Western Ghats, what we call as Iranad region of Kerala, and the Thira Pradesh in that way. So the coastal and the midland areas where their labor was very much there in rice production and other agricultural activities, I think the history becomes very much different. And in fact, we wish to explore this further in some of the projects that we are proposing now to look at how they have ended up in the international slave routes. And in fact, my friend Vinil has done some research in that area, and I'm also looking at some of this, and I have come across the people ending up in the Cape Colony in South Africa, people of Kerala origin. So, and some of the books I have also seen references to Puraya. So obviously, there is a Indo-Ocean transaction of this people. So now, even if we are not immediately referring to these international transactions, we do have a transaction within Kerala, and that makes, I think, this a bit the Adivasi enslavement different from that of the enslavement of Dalit caste. Yeah. So for want of time, I stop here.
Thank you, sir. Over to you, Dr. M.T. Narayanan.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sanal, for being with us for such a long time and sharing with your views. With this, we conclude one more fruitful session of the International Online Workshop on Sensing the Past. We now invite our research scholar, Mr. Avinash Simon, for proposing a formal vote of thanks.
MT and Shiva, you are doing wonderful things. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Narayanan, for wonderfully moderating section, and thank you, Dr. Shiva, for those questions. Dr. P. Sanal Mohan is one such scholar who has influenced me immeasurably, both as a person and as an aspiring historian. Hence, with utmost humility, with the History Department of Sri Shankaracharya University, likes to express our profound gratitude for not only sparing his valuable time for us to grace this occasion, but also for enlightening us with his exceptional lecture on the subject matter and enhancing our understanding pertaining to the use of archives and the search for sources. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so looking forward for another session in the coming days. Over to you, Shiva, for making announcements, if any, and to conclude.
Thank you.